Hey everybody, welcome to today's Firelight Chat. I'm very excited to be talking to my guest today. His name is Alan Collinge, and he is the founder of StudentLoanJustice.com. You've probably heard me talk quite a bit about the fact that I think we should cancel all these college loan debts. You've probably heard me talk about why I think so. I think it was predatory behavior to begin with, that our young people should never have been put through this. And I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't this way in America. University of Florida, University of Texas, University of California all had systems where people could more than affordably be able to get a higher education. And if we align public policy with the things that would actually help people thrive, of course we would be supporting our young people, not thwarting them in their efforts to get a higher education, as is true in every other advanced democracy. As I said, Alan is the founder of Student Loan Justice. It was created in 2005, a grassroots organization dedicated to informing the public about the predatory underpinnings of both federal and private student loans. That's the thing. I think too many people just don't remember when it wasn't this way, and too many people, I think, don't realize how predatory this actually is. Returning standard bankruptcy rights to all student loans, another issue which is outrageous, and canceling federally owned loans by executive orders. So I'm looking forward to hearing Alan tell us how that gets done. Alan is the author of The Student Loan Scam, published by Beacon Press in 2008, and he was selected as one of 7 financial heroes by CNN/Money Magazine in December 2008. Alan, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Marianne. I'm thrilled to be here.
You know, I don't know how all our listeners are, but I know for me, it really helps to hear a timeline. When I hear about a problem, I want to know, how did this start? What happened? It helps me sort of figure it out. So can you go back in time? How did all this start, and what started it?
Sure, I'll try and give you the 50-year timeline in less than a couple minutes. So in 1965, the Higher Education Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, and this was where federal student loans were created for all intents. And President Johnson at the time declared that the loans would be free of interest. Well, some other things happened shortly thereafter. Something you may be familiar with, something called the Powell Memo, which was an advisor to Richard Nixon. They were very worried about all the things they saw going on during the 60s. And shortly after this Powell Memo was written, a company called Sallie Mae was created, which was a government-sponsored entity to warehouse loans student loans in order to facilitate people going to college. Well, really, greed crept into the system, Marianne. It's pretty
Shocking,
much,
just shocking. Who would have
I
thought
know,
it?
it's just that simple. So the thing about no interest was out the window. Interest began to be charged. But what's probably most insidious is that standard consumer protections that exist for all other loans were stripped uniquely from student loans. So bankruptcy rights, which the founding fathers called for in the Constitution. Nobody wants to file for bankruptcy. It's unpleasant and shameful, but it is a key to keeping good faith in any lending system. And that was taken away. Statutes of limitations, fair debt collection practices, truth in lending laws, even state usury laws do not apply to federal student loans. So the loans were essentially weaponized, turned into kind of a license to steal. The lenders can, stack as many penalties, fees, etc., as they can think of onto the backs of the students, the borrowers, I should say. And it's with impunity. So there's really nothing that the borrowers at this point can do. They can't run, they can't hide because statutes of limitations are gone. They can hound them for the rest of their life. And now today, what we see is the result of all that. We see $1.6 trillion owing, and despite the cancellations we've seen from Biden in recent years, at the rate that we're going, we're going to owe well over $3 trillion in 10 years. And that's with the cancellations we're hearing about nowadays. So the lending system has catastrophically failed, Marianne. The last I checked before the pandemic, 85% of all borrowers were never going to be able to repay their loans. That's probably gone up to 90% or even higher now here today. But for the lack of courage and will in Washington, D.C., I think this lending program probably would have been, kicked to the curb. It would have been taken to the bath and drowned in the tub, as conservatives like to say. But there's some very dark and strong forces in Washington, D.C., and they perpetuate this lending. I call it a scam because it really is a scam. There's no better word.
So you said that Lyndon Johnson back in the 1960s started the student loans in general, but he said that there would be no no interest loans. You also mentioned the Lewis Powell memo, and I think a lot of people don't realize, everyone, this was a memo. Alan just said that it was in response to what was happening in the 60s. Yeah, a great explosion of concern for social justice that was happening in the 1960s. And people such as Lewis Powell and ultra-conservative forces found that very antithetical to their goals, their short-term profit-making goals, and the idea that a group of people who would be able to accumulate greater and greater wealth should basically be entitled to govern what was going on in the country. So these student debts, they were predatory, as Alan has said and as I have said. There's something really immoral about taking human desperation and turning it into a profit center. And this is particularly, and this had a lot to do also with people of color, because for black students particularly, there was this idea that if you will get an education, that this is the way to close the wage gap and that your life will be so much better. And instead, in the cases of so many millions of people, this has just been another set of invisible chains by which people have been shackled to circumstances that could, as Alan said, be with them for the rest of their lives. There are people, not just young people, but boomers. I was reading somewhere where somebody talked about how the American dream used to be to own a house with a picket fence, and for far too many people, the American dream is simply to be able to get out of debt before you die. And a lot of that debt that people have accumulated, and we should remember the emotional, psychological effects of debt. It's crippling, and so many people cannot even foresee getting out of those debts before they die.
Yeah, so in the olden days, it started out where the banks were making the loans. The government was guaranteeing the loans. So in the case of a default, the government would pay the banks, buy the loan, and go from there. Well, as of 2010, the federal government is now the lender. So the federal government makes the loans, makes the interest on the loans, which is about $108 billion per year. And unfortunately, while you'd think the banks were kicked out of the process, they really weren't. So the companies that used to be lenders are still now in the system as both servicers that collect your payments, but also, and this is most troubling to me, as collectors who hound borrowers in the case of a default. So the powers that the collection industry has would make a mobster envious, in the words of Elizabeth Warren, and it's true. You can garnish Social Security income, disability income. You can get people fired from public employment. You can suspend people's driver's licenses, their professional licenses, on and on and on, garnish their wages without a court order. And so all the old style banks are still doing all the things they used to do. They don't make the interest on the loans, now the government does, but from the borrower's perspective, the lending program is just as predatory, as hyperinflationary as it's ever been.
So, in other words, there's a kind of economically unholy alliance, lenders, government, and banks. And, everything that you just described, there's so much human despair. First of all, just carrying these loans, but then what happens to you if you can't pay them? And, Alan, on my out on the campaign trail and just living my life, I have met so many people who got the degree. And first of all, just the psychological debt is crippling anyway, but the psychological effects of being in your 20s, at that stage of a person's development, your 20s carrying tens of thousands of dollars of loan debt, I can't even imagine being anywhere. I can't imagine who I would be today if I had to carry that. And I get so I find it ridiculous that we're so mystified where the mental health crisis comes from. The economic anxiety, that pressure, that constant worry that would come with that kind of thing, and everything that you just described. What if I default? Then what they'll do to me? But I've met people who said, well, I got my degree in the area I want to be in, and now I do the math. I've got the degree, but if I go into that area and I do the math, starting with a beginning position, I can't even imagine getting out of this until I'm in my 50s or 60s. So forget it. I'll go work in some area where I'll be able to get these loans off my back. So why did I even go to college? And that is contributing to a great impulse around the country of people saying, like, we need more dumbing down, right? We need less education. All right, so I just want to deconstruct these things as we go along. So that is where we are today, correct? So you said about how many people are affected today? How many people are carrying these loans today?
Well, there's 42 roughly million people walking around with federal student loans. There's another 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, probably 15 million people who either have private student loans or are co-signed on them. So the total student borrower population is well over 50 million people. And importantly, as I said earlier, 85% of those people were never going to be able to repay their loans even before the pandemic. So we're talking about 38, 40 plus million people in the country who are, losing sleep over their student loans. A lot of people talk about the income-driven repayment plans as salvation or whatever, but I'm here to tell you, Marianne, those IDR plans are wolves in sheep's clothing, because many, many decades of history shows the overwhelming majority of borrowers never make it through those plans. They are run in the worst of bad faith by the Department of Education and its contractors. And so it's, the emotional toll this is taking on people is like something I don't think we've ever seen before as a result of a debt, much less a government-sponsored debt that was supposed to help people, right? The ironies are never ending.
Well, I don't think government sees itself that way. That's the sort of Rooseveltian vision that's the point of public policy, but particularly among our young. I've said often that we shouldn't run our country like a business. We should run our country like a family. You support your kids in doing well so that they can fly. And we thwart these young people at a time when we should be supporting them and becoming everything that they can be, as is true in every other advanced democracy, in which the idea that these kids can't take things to the highest achievement level that they possibly can is just considered common sense. Okay, so from what you said that's about $1.5 trillion debt now, but a few minutes ago you said it's on its way. It's going to be at $3 trillion. Explain that to me.
That's right. So every year, $108 billion in interest accrues to the Department of Education. $100 billion in new loans go out. And so not even counting capitalized interest, and even including, say, $131 billion in student loan cancellation every 3 years, which is what we've seen Joe Biden do, even under those conditions, we're still going to see the loan portfolio double, more than double in the next 10 years. And so this is unsustainable. Yep.
So let's talk about what Biden has tried to do. Now, I've heard people say that if he had just come in at the beginning and said we're going to cancel all of it, that he might have had more of a shot at making it happen. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's exactly what he should have done. In fact, I think the biggest mistake of Donald Trump's presidency was that he didn't use the pandemic as an excuse to cancel the entire lending program. The entire lending program. I mean, there's no baby left, Marianne. It's all bathwater at this point, in my opinion. And I think most people in Washington, D.C. who work in this area, they know this. They don't have the courage to admit it. But Joe Biden certainly could have come in, as Donald Trump did, believe it or not. Donald Trump, surprisingly, was the first president to broadly cancel federal student loans by executive order. He did it for veterans before the pandemic, and he did it for everyone with the first repayment pause, which he did by executive order. There were no lawsuits, there was no challenges, he just did it. And so too could have Joe Biden done that. So I think there's some other things going on back in Washington, D.C., Marianne. I think Biden was insincere about canceling loans, and yeah.
All right, so let's go back to that. So Trump had done it by executive order. Then Biden lifted the moratorium at the end of the COVID. Is that what it was when he ended the emergency?
Yeah, Biden attempted to do a limited cancellation. He pointed to very sort of head-scratching law to justify it. He could have just pointed to the Higher Education Act, which gives the Secretary of Education very broad authority to waive, compromise, release, cancel student loans. The Congress gave the president that power many years ago in 1965, even before actually. So that law has been on the books for many years. Biden didn't even try to use that. He used something called the HEROES Act, which was a 2003 piece of legislation, which only applied to national emergencies. You know, having looked at this for many years, Marianne, I can tell you that Joe Biden had no real desire or intentions of canceling loans. And quite frankly, the establishment, DNC, people like Nancy Pelosi, Susan Rice, I don't think they wanted to see loan cancellation by executive order either. And
Can you
so I
tell me
think there
why
was,
not, please? What is the benefit to them in not canceling those debts?
well, when you cancel the loans by executive order, no money changes hands. No money needs to be drawn from the Treasury. Nothing is added to the national debt. And just in general, people in Washington, D.C., they tend, the way Congress would cancel loans is to pass a law, cancel loans, and because of pay-go rules, they would, it would be their excuse to raise $1.6 trillion in new tax money in order to pay for student loan cancellation. It's the stupidest thing in the world, but I think, Washington, D.C. runs on money, and I think the Department of Education and others, they would love to have 1.6 trillion in new tax money that they can play with and sort of pretend to cancel loans like they've been doing for the past 30, 40 years. So
Right.
I think the swamp can't stand the thought of simply canceling debt. They want to be paid for it. And that's really too bad because think of all the lives that are harmed by not canceling the loans, such as what you mentioned. And by the way, it's not just young people, Marianne. Young
No, it's
people,
the older people too. A
the
lot of
old,
baby boomers even.
yeah, in fact, most student loan borrowers now are over the age of 35. There are more student loan borrowers over the age of 50 than under the age of 25. And the older crowd, believe it or not, they owe on average 3 times more than the younger people today who are just getting out of college. And that is outrageous because the people leaving college today are on average for undergrad leaving college with $40,000 in debt. And so, if the previous generations, including mine, were being hurt, and we were, the up and coming generations are going to be absolutely massacred at the current pace.
Okay, so let's say we elect a president who says this is it, enough is enough. Go back to basically, I can't even believe I'm saying these words, but go back to what Trump did. Cancel this thing. But you're saying I could use the Higher Education Act to cancel it for everyone. And
Yeah,
this would not be challenged?
well, it would be challenged, but once you do it, it's kind of hard to unring that bell, right? Like that's basically what Trump did. For veterans certainly, he canceled them, and then he announced that he canceled them, and there was no litigation.
Well, but then why
Um,
was there litigation when Biden tried to cancel some of it?
it was purely politics. It was the issue got turned into a political football with the Democrats for cancellation, Republicans against it. And once it entered that political football realm, then that's when the lawsuits started happening. That's when, the media got involved, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was really sorry to see the way it all panned out. And the Republicans should not be against this issue. I mean, these loans are robbing the states. I mean, look at Texas, $141 billion in mostly federal student loan debt. It's $8.5 billion being sucked in interest, being sucked out of the state of Texas and sent to the coffers of the Department of Education
Yeah,
every year. There's nothing
yes.
that any conservative can say or do. I mean, no true
No,
conservative should be
no.
supporting that. It's
Well,
a
if you
state
have a corporate,
sovereignty issue, right? It's
yeah.
outrageous.
Well, if you have a corporatist mentality, you see job creation as a function of huge corporate entities up on Mount Olympus somewhere,
Yeah.
dropping crumbs off off the cliff in the form of job creation. But for those of us with a more I think socially enlightened perspective, certainly progressive perspective. Money comes from creativity and productivity, and nobody has that flowing more than young people. I have ideas, they have projects, they have things they want to go for, things they want to make. How many of them would just love nothing more than $2,500 discretionary spending to start that web business or whatever? And they're just loaded down. I mean, anything that helps people thrive stimulates the economy. And this kind of thing, just as you said, is actually suppressing the economy. If you suppress people, you're suppressing your economy, except for a very, very few who are basically exploiting the many. Okay, so let's say you have a president, wink, wink, who says enough is enough with this, uses the Higher Education Act, and says we're canceling all of it, and we're basically economically liberating 50 million people, okay, who deserve to be liberated. They are Americans. The job is, the government is instituted to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Too often we forget that that's our theoretical North Star. You're saying Higher Education Act. So tell me how we do it. I know different countries have different systems. I know what Germany has. You go as high as your own level of achievement takes you, and then when you get to a certain point in the money that you're making, which of course the government can see, and tax records, et cetera, you start paying back. What do you see as the optimum system?
Well, what you just described, I think, is totally workable. Australia, same way. A regimented, uniform system by which, if you use public money to go to college, say maybe a couple of different classes for undergrad, maybe community college, 3-tier graduate school, 3 tiers, you would have essentially a tax liability for, maybe 10, 12, 15 years, depending on what makes sense, where you pay a certain percentage of your income in a very automatic, regimented way. So there's no loans, there's no interest. It's the same for all, and maybe some people will get a better deal, maybe some people maybe not quite as good of a deal, but that seems to be the best way that a government can fund higher education, because clearly the government should not be in the lending business, certainly not in this country, not the Department of Education, not the Office of Federal Student Aid. I mean, what we've seen, the corporate capture of the Department of Education, those offices I just mentioned, it is guaranteed to ruin any well-intentioned lending program that you might try, as long as these private entities are in the mix.
These lending companies and the banks, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I notice, Alan, and I feel the same way about socialized medicine or universal health care as they have it in, that's certainly what it would be called in Germany and places like that. It's just the lack of anxiety that people in these countries are carrying when it comes to health care, when it comes to education costs. You see hope that there's when I remember I was giving a talk in England, and it was at Cambridge University, and I had noticed already earlier in the day, being with some of the students, it just reminded me it was a very different time in America when you just saw young people with that much sense of what was possible. It's palpable. But also when I mentioned that there are over 1 million people rationing their insulin here, people just looked in disbelief. They couldn't even believe it. So I see these college loans, the burden of it, it's the same as the ridiculous way that we do not have universal health care. And as you said before, it's institutional greed, that's all it is. Whether it's greed of insurance companies, greed of banks, greed of lenders, or in this case, even the greed of the government.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, the student loan precedent, which really the core of this is the removal of the bankruptcy protections that the founding fathers
And
for the Constitution.
didn't,
Very
didn't,
dangerous.
didn't
Sorry.
Joe Biden have something to do with that?
As a junior senator, Joe Biden was mentioned by name when Dennis DeConcini, the senator from Arizona, when they originally started stripping bankruptcy rights from student loans in the 1970s. Joe Biden was a surprisingly key guy. And then in 2005, he was pretty much the #1 guy that honchoed the bankruptcy bill of that year. which stripped bankruptcy rights from private student loans. And so, yeah, this is a very slippery slope, Marianne, because if they can do to other loans, other debt, what they've done to student loans, they will. And believe me, there are some dark forces in the Capitol who would love to make medical debt similarly non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. Credit cards, auto loans. In fact, there's nowhere that stops. If you can do it to student loans, you can do it to all consumer debt. And that's exactly what the founders didn't want when they
That's
called for
right.
uniform bankruptcy laws. So
Right,
it's very
right.
slippery slope.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm surprised that given that in the Constitution, that no one has challenged that in court.
Yeah, what they'll say is, oh no, you can discharge your loans in bankruptcy if you can prove something called undue hardship, and many
Okay.
years of jurisprudence that have been built up around that concept.
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes, even today, despite what you may read, it is essentially impossible to discharge student loans in
Yeah.
bankruptcy. So
Well, that's a really
technically, the saying you can discharge your loans in bankruptcy, your student loans, is kind of like saying you can win the lottery. I mean, that's
yeah.
last year 45 people, or maybe even less, 45 people out of 200,000 people with student loans who filed for bankruptcy last year. Yeah, only 45 got it. So we're talking about just a vanishingly small percentage. But to the
What?
letter of the law, the people in Washington D.C. will argue all day long that bankruptcy hasn't been removed.
Well, what you said is really terrifying. I mean, you have 1 in 4 Americans living with medical debt. If you start telling people they can't discharge medical debt, or you even mentioned credit card debt, um, and that is undue hardship. It's just such a level of psychological and emotional anxiety that people live with month after month, year after year, and that destroys family systems. It destroys marriages. It destroys communities. Just that people are so beaten down. We have to change it, and I really appreciate the work that you do, because I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes we're not clear about some of what exactly happened when. So just real quick before I let you go, I know that when I was growing up, the University of California was sort of a crown jewel of, of all of this, and it was Ronald Reagan who came in and
Yeah, on Ronald Reagan's watch, the shift from grants to loans really got put on steroids, and
on
so
all kinds of things, including our farming sector and
yeah, making government run like a business, it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. The government doesn't make a profit on anything, and it shouldn't. Except for student loans, by the way. The Department of Education is turning a massive profit on student loans. And
it's the
I can only
tentacle.
hope that good people out there will start listening to the people. And I only hope that you can shake up the Democratic Party, because, Marianne, I'm telling you, the Democratic Party is not your father's Democratic Party.
No, it's not. It's not. I have learned that more in this campaign than ever. It's not the Democratic Party I grew up with. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of Republicans feel the same way too. It's not the Republican Party they grew up with. The high minded conservative and liberal principles, which used to more than not prevail. We have the requisite despair, God knows, and people, we just have to alchemize it. We have to turn the despair into motivation for political activism and to know it can be different. That's part of the problem. I think for someone my age, I remember when it was different. And so it's easier for me to guffaw. It's easier for me to
Right.
say, what is this? Whereas
Yeah.
so many people were born in generations who have never known it to be different. And this
Yeah.
just acceptance of this situation that seems so normalized, well, this is just how it is. And then you mix that with the fact that too many people don't see how electoral politics can help fix it. Because in their generation, they never saw electoral politics break in their direction. And even when it did in certain ways, it didn't as much as we thought it did. So I've lived to see all of it, and I understand where the cynicism comes from, but we must pull ourselves out of it and know that we can change this. But we have to be willing to say no more and stop farming out our critical thought and saying we the people. I keep going back to the Declaration of Independence, because Abraham Lincoln said, it's our eternal rebuke to forces of tyranny and oppression. And this is economic tyranny. This is economic oppression. For people to know that, to see that, to recognize that. And in the Declaration where it says that governments are instituted to secure the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think living without constant debt that was imposed upon you by banks, lenders, and your government, this is certainly an issue, right? And the next principle in the Declaration is that if the government is not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter that. And or abolish it. I don't think we should abolish it, but alter it, damn right, is what we need to do now.
You're absolutely right. And I can only hope the young people watching this today will realize we do not, in fact, we must not stand for this because,
thank you.
We're fighting for ourselves and our own, and there's nothing wrong with fighting for your own economic liberty. There's nothing wrong. And I know a lot of students are so well-meaning and good faith. They, debt is a very personal issue. John Adams said there's two ways to conquer an enslaved country. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. And how true that is. A personal issue like debt really puts your own
well-being,
your own ego and everything. It's very hard for people to publicly protest against debt that they hold. It's just the nature of the beast. And I would just tell the young people out there, we've got to throw this off our backs, because not only are we fighting for our own interests, we're fighting for hundreds of millions of people who are going to follow in our footsteps. And if we allow this to stand, there's nowhere good that this goes.
Well, I think that that's one of the areas in which we think this is my problem, my pain, as opposed to realizing, no, this is everybody around me has the same pain. Yes. And it's kind of, there's a little shame attached to it.
Yes.
So people aren't as readily conversant about it, and like, oh, let me tell you about my college loan. People have some, and everybody's just wrapped up in their own cocoon of pain. And that's why not numbing that pain is so important, everyone. This is not a moment to numb our pain. It's a moment to recognize it and to see how ubiquitous it is among us, and to say we've got to stand up now and change things. And that's
when 4 in 5 borrowers are losing sleep, you're definitely not alone out there.
And it's not just a sleep problem.
It's our silence and our shame that's really perpetuating this whole thing. We got to get over that, and we've got to unite, and we got to put our foot down for today and for future generations. Very important.
Well, I agree with you. I thank you so much for explaining the facts to us. Once again, it's Alan Collinge. He's the go-to man to talk to us about the college loan debt and how we are going to remove those invisible shackles from the backs of millions of people. One way is to elect me, of course, but it's a much bigger issue than any one candidate, too. Thank you, Alan. Alan, tell people where they can read more, learn more about your work and all of that.
Yeah, it's just studentloanjustice.org, and you can find all of our different channels from there. I might also add the petition change.org/cancel student loans. We've got about 1.2 million people on that petition now. No good reason we can't get it up to 15 or 20 million. I'd love to see that.
Well, please send that to me so I can post it on my own platforms. Okay? Thank you.
I surely will, Marianne.
Thank you so much, and good on you. And I hope that we will have the opportunity to work together with some power in our hands.
I hope so too. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. God bless you. Okay, everybody, cancel those college loan debts. Let's all just have that intention, and that intention turning into activism, turning into political power, and we will get it done. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.